Well, we're back from our Thanksgiving break, and the city is popping this week. We have the issue of groundwater pumping that's come to the city council, and also an issue of a new school that was proposed. Now, a couple weeks ago, we had Jolie, a district parent, as our guest, talking about the secondary schools committee of the enrollment committee of the district, and their preliminary proposal, one of which was for a new school. So, Elena, why are we revisiting the topic this week? What's happened?
Well, the week right before Thanksgiving break, all of a sudden this application was posted on a Facebook page to this XQ Super Schools project, which is an education initiative launched by Lorraine Palo Jobs, who of course is Steve Jobs' widow, and she runs this education nonprofit that does a lot of related work. And so this application was for a detailed proposal for a district school to open at Coverly. Sounded a lot like the proposal that EMAC had made for this innovative, very different kind of middle and high school that would open there. And on the committee were photographs of team members, including the superintendent, Max McGee, and all of the members of the EMAC Secondary Schools Committee, including Jolie, along with some people from the Stanford Design School and some other people who had been involved in putting together this application, and it was the first a lot of people had heard about it when it was posted on that Facebook page.
Okay, so this was after the recommendations had been presented to the board?
Yeah, they first presented them in late October, preliminary proposals, and then again at a board meeting in November, on November 10th, and that was actually after they had already started working on that application. They started work on it about November 4th, thinking that it was going to be due November 15th. So they presented to the board November 10th in the midst of all of that, the work around this XQ proposal.
Can we clarify exactly what the application is for? I mean, what is
well, so technically it's a concept submission, which they're getting feedback on. It's a very early stage of the proposal, or of the whole competition, and a full proposal is due in February.
And how much money are they hoping to get from these jobs?
The entire competition is $50 million, and they're going to choose either 5 or more winning applicants who would get $10 million each.
Okay.
So this is a national competition that will attract probably like thousands of interested parties.
Yeah.
And the spirit of the competition then is to propose, create new innovative schools.
And public high schools in particular.
Public high schools.
Yeah.
So it could be a charter school as well,
I'm
it
not
has
sure.
to be within the district?
It can't be a private school.
I see.
It can be
I think it can be a charter.
Public charter.
Okay,
Yeah.
or just a public, within the public district.
Yes.
So what was the reaction when news started coming out about this application that some people in the community, including some of the committee members,
There were sort of two sides to it. I mean, the people who hadn't known about it, I think, were pretty shocked. It was a very detailed proposal. A lot of the things that the EMAC and Max have said, are beyond the scope of this committee, about how the school would be designed and curriculum and sort of ideas about the philosophy of the school were contained in this application. And we've posted that online for people to see since it's since been taken down from the Facebook page. So it was very detailed.
Yeah.
The application has been removed from the Facebook page?
Yes.
So had the board, the school board, heard about the XQ application prior to the Facebook page with the application on it then?
They had not, and they started hearing, I think, as soon as other community members started hearing about it that week during Thanksgiving break. And then on that Friday, Max posted a weekly update, and he informed the board about it and said, this is on the table. It's a placeholder for potential funding with no strings attached. We may or may not be able to take advantage of it. It's a very early stages. And that was the first time that he officially informed the board about it.
So we're dealing here with a matter of what appears to be a concrete idea moving forward when the board hasn't even vetted the idea or agreed that this is a direction that the school district wants to go.
Right, and the entire enrollment committee hasn't yet made their final recommendations to the board, and that was supposed to happen next Tuesday, and it's now been postponed till January.
Yeah, so this issue brought to light some internal conflicts within the entire enrollment management committee, because they broke out into two separate subcommittees, the elementary school level and the middle high school level. What's the gist of the rift within that overall committee?
Maybe before you answer that, we should explain why that committee was even formed in the first place back in the spring in April. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, it was, so before my time, this has been tried before to look at enrollment growth in Palo Alto. I think there have been two previous committees, and one was tasked with specifically looking at opening a 13 elementary school. So this, when Max first proposed to charter this committee, it was really about, let's take a much broader look at enrollment issues and not start it with the end in mind of opening a 13th elementary school or whatever the specific outcome you think might need to be. So he proposed that, the board approved the creation of the committee, and they were really supposed to look at enrollment trends. Are our schools too big? What does each level, elementary, middle, and high school, really need in the next however many years in terms of capacity and facilities?
So this application sounds like a pretty radical departure from that mission you just described. Is that fair to say?
That's the sense. And then I think there's also the sense that size of schools and things like student connectedness and philosophy around how schools should operate are very intertwined. But there's also been this strange sort of confluence of the two things and all these discussions about enrollment, and since the EMAC proposed opening a new school.
So I didn't mean to step on Jocelyn's question, which was basically to describe the conflict that has emerged from within the committee.
Well, I want to mention, though, that part of the charter of the group was to look at solutions, and I think the term long-term actually was in the initial description. And I think it's whenever people get kind of a charge and it's a little bit on the open-ended side, because you want them to be diving in and trying to figure out, what the best information for the public should be. You'll almost inevitably come up with these kinds of questions. It's like, well, is this what we're supposed to be doing? Is this not what we're supposed to be doing? And when we talked to the subcommittee members earlier this week, it seemed like they were debating that same thing for the first several months of their.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that the district apparently had a hard time even getting people to serve on this committee. Diane Reckless, who's a former board member, was signed up, and she had been waiting to hear, and sort of the timeline passed. They were supposed to start in either February or March, and she told us this week that she called and said, what's up, I'd love to join. And they said, well, you're the only person who's applied. So
really?
I think it took them a while to get started. And they even said themselves, and I was looking back at my notes from sort of June meetings when they decided to split into the two elementary and secondary subcommittees, it's a huge issue to tackle, and they were struggling with how exactly to dive into it.
Yeah, well, we don't want to undercut that.
By contrast to earlier efforts, this was not a representative group at all. It just consisted of a handful of parents.
Yeah, they're all parents, so there's no teachers or enrollment specialists. I don't know who that would be, but yeah, it's all parent volunteers.
Okay. I kind of do want to get back to the internal conflict situation, but Bill, you just mentioned that there have been other enrollment committees in the past. My overall sense was that it seemed like not a lot resulted from those efforts. Do you recall specifically?
Well, I'm not going to be good on the dates,
Okay.
but a few years ago, I think it was in 2012 or 13, there was a whole nother round of this with a very large and diverse committee that worked very hard and came up with a lot of alternatives that included some pretty controversial options, such as moving the immersion programs out of Ohlone and Escondido. So there's a lot of, similar to what was emerging from this, a lot of potential for disagreement and conflict. But at the time, Superintendent Skelly basically, and with the support of the board, just decided to table the entire discussion.
Okay.
Basically, I think, with the notion that at that time the district just didn't feel like it had the financial resources to open another school.
This was during the recession.
Yeah. There was still a real conservatism about the financial picture. Very frustrating for the people on that committee.
Understandable.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that brings us back to present day.
There's one member of EMAC, Todd Collins, who's the chair of the elementary subcommittee, who at one of the board meetings spoke publicly and sort of challenged his peer committee on their findings and has criticized their analysis, and really thinks that if we're going to move forward with a new school, it's going to damage which proposed simultaneous efforts to make any changes or reforms in the current high schools, and that opening a new school is just going to consume a lot of effort and money and time over the next few years, and the needed changes at the existing high schools won't happen.
It seems like a very legitimate concern, and it seems like this kind of the crux of the debate that the school board should be having but wasn't, which to me is the most absurd thing about this whole story. How this whole thing came out from like a very small group of volunteers, and there almost seems to be a bit of a kind of a preaching to the choir flavor to it. I mean, you mentioned in your story that there was a movie that was shown about this innovative, the buzzword.
Most likely to succeed.
Yeah, at Gun High, and then afterwards they did a poll, and the poll showed that yes, we want one of those in Palo Alto. After this movie, it's kind of like, I don't know, pick a movie. Going to see Food Inc. and then asking people, would you like a Big Mac afterwards? So it was very like kind of insular group.
And I think, at least one board member I know recognized that, and there was an email she wrote to the superintendent saying, that was a selective group of people who went to go see that movie, and so of course they're probably going to be interested in this kind of an idea.
But then the superintendent used that as one of the bases for why he kind of participated in this effort, right? The fact that there was such a high level of support.
I don't think, he hasn't particularly said that. I think it was just a signal to people who are already interested in those kind of innovative ideas of doing something differently in the district that there was community support for it, and took that and ran with it.
I don't think there's any doubt that this movie and frustrations with how slow change occurs within this district, especially at the high school levels, has given rise to a significant number of people in the community, who knows how large, that really wants to implement some significant changes to the secondary school program here. And I think they've attached to this idea of a new school as being a way to implement that changed vision. The elephant in the room here really is, what does that all say about the condition of our two high schools? And how, on the one hand, do you articulate all these failures of our high schools in a grant application to justify starting a new school, without really addressing, why do we have two schools that we're saying that about? And I think that's where the board is going to need to untangle this.
Well, it sends a difficult message to the very, school committee that EMAC is saying we need a new design task force made up of teachers and students and, a more diverse set of stakeholders to tackle this issue, and yet they're, putting forward some strong criticisms of how that community operates.
Yeah, I think everybody on the secondary school EMAC subcommittee is now trying to emphasize the fact that they're not simply arguing for consideration of a new high school. They also acknowledge and advocate reforms to our existing schools. But that all gets kind of muddled in terms of how we then move forward.
Yeah, I think the fact that we've got 5 parent volunteers who are on this subcommittee, some of whom haven't had a whole lot of, district experience, and they are tasked with, analyze all this data and come up with some concrete recommendations so that we can have some sort of direction. I think that's a pretty tall order, and I can see that they're still refining what it is that they're recommending. This past week they came out with additional information on a website attached to the school district, and handed us a one-page kind of summary of 5 points that they were recommending for this design task force to look into, which included, both house system implementation at the high schools, plus possibly an innovative school, plus look at enrollment, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So
and their
there's a lot
top
still.
recommendations have really evolved. If you look at their October report and their November report, and then this document that was posted online this week, it has evolved from the emphasis on let's open a new school and let's reform our existing schools to let's take a step back, let's charter another committee who is more equipped with dealing with that, and move that forward before we decide what to actually do.
I think everyone seems to recognize that the pace of change in the school district can be frustrating. You just made that point, but it's just realizing that Todd Collins, kind of paradoxically, Todd Collins' column in our paper this week mentions like the block schedule and all these other programs that took a while, and he was using it to say that we need to be inclusive, we need to make sure that all these things take time, and we don't want to suck resources out in order to start a new school. But at the same time, you can use that argument to say, you know, come on, school district, let's try to figure out a process where we can get innovative, important, significant changes made fairly quickly. Yeah, and that's staring at the school board at this point.
I think this community group that is pretty much a self-appointed group of folks that is trying to advance this idea is ultimately going to provide a really valuable service, because it's surfaced a lot of strong and emotional opinions about the current state of our secondary school program in Palo Alto. The dicey part of it is that they've collectively made statements that will be very hard for school board members to agree with, in the sense that it's a pretty strong indictment, really, of what we're now delivering in terms of a high school program in particular. So if you're a school board member, how do you move forward with looking at an innovative new school concept while at the same time not acknowledging that we've been running a district that is not adequately addressing these needs? One of the most interesting parts of that application to me was reference to mental health needs of our high school students and social emotional needs. And the application basically argued that we're paying lip service to those needs in our current high schools. And that is not the way a school board member nor the superintendent would want to be describing their response to what's gone on in this community.
To what extent is it just kind of the inherent conflict between like Silicon Valley innovators and regular good old-fashioned democracy? I mean, you don't expect the school board to move fast, just like you wouldn't expect the city council to move fast on ideas. There's a democratic process, there's usually committees and input, and it feels like there's this small group that just kind of wants to circumvent all that and just say, hey, let's use the word innovative and repeat it many, many times, and then that'll be a solution.
I think there's a part of that, but I think more importantly, it's that there is such a reluctance in this community to talk about our faults and the need to make change if you're in positions of power and influence. And so I think that it's really hard to not feel, if you're an elected official or a school administrator, to not feel like your job is to be a cheerleader for the way things are and to move very incrementally. And when you've got an increasing group of, in this case, parents that are saying, that's just not good enough, we need to do more, I just think they're not as used to dealing with the complexities of a democratic process as the elected officials are. But I think what it leads to is the need for the electeds, the school board member and the superintendent, to recognize we need to get moving here, and we need to do it in an open, transparent way. The things that have been kept in secret from the public are silly. There's no reason why these things shouldn't just be out there and be talked about.
Well, that's kind of like the crux of the matter. Usually, like when things like this happen, you could have like a good idea that dies just because it was such a bad process. I mean,
and that's what I think nobody wants to see happen.
Exactly. I mean, when you look at like at the council level, 27 University, not saying that was a great idea, but it did have some merits. But they never even got around to discussing the merits because it was so secret that there was such an uproar that it kind of got killed immediately. So it would be a shame if there's real merit to these kind of innovative ideas, and just because it was done so secretly, the word gets tossed out.
Yeah, and so. I don't think that's going to happen in this case. But there are some parallels to 27 University, where I mean, the only reason that I think that didn't explode even bigger and reflect more poorly on city manager Jim Keene is the fact that it wasn't just Jim Keene, which is the parallel to Max McGee in this situation. But the entire council, it turned out, had been involved in these behind closed door meetings. So it would be the equivalent of the school board having been engaged with McGee on developing this proposal. And of course, that's not what happened here.
I think the word undisclosed was in both headlines also.
I'm sure it was.
Yeah. Well, Elena, what's the next step in this whole matter?
So things have very much slowed down. EMAC is going to meet actually once this month on December 14th.
The whole committee?
The whole committee, yeah, elementary and secondary subcommittees. Again in early January, and then it's scheduled to present their final report to the board, I think on January 12th. So we'll see how that all goes.
Okay, all right. We'll turn our attention to another issue that has bubbled up to the surface once again. We're going to talk about basement construction and groundwater pumping.
Yes.
We've talked about this issue, well, the community's talked about this issue numerous times over numerous years, but for some reason right now the council is paying some attention to it and taking some action. So what happened this week?
The reason is number 14, which is how many basements were dewatered this summer. In the past, the city had between 5 to 10 applications for dewatering, which is basically the pumping of groundwater that takes place when somebody wants to build a basement in an area close to the creek or the bay where there's groundwater. So people are seeing tons of these projects, more people building basement. At the same time, as everyone knows, we're in a drought. So when you're watching like a pipe with like thousands of gallons of water pouring out, it's bad optics. Whether or not it really has an impact on the environment, it makes people angry seeing that much water flowing out. Yeah. So as a result of both of these things, it's become a bigger issue again. And this week, a committee of the city council had its first discussion of it in several years, and they've agreed to kind of go forth with this multifaceted plan.
Okay. One of the people that you talked with had some really interesting kind of anecdotal information about what happened when a neighbor of his was doing a basement construction project. Yes. Doors were shifting.
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
You hear these anecdotes quite a bit, and a few more. I heard a few more at the Tuesday night meeting with the Policy and Services Committee where this was discussed. But yeah, people are complaining that when there's dewatering happening in the neighborhood, there's subsidence, and sometimes doors don't open, sometimes there's cracks in the foundation. One of the big concerns from the roughly 200 people who signed a petition calling for a moratorium on dewatering, one of the big concerns is infrastructure damage, tree damage, things that happen in the kind of very localized area where these projects occur. And it doesn't help that they all occur kind of in a similar, very confined geographic area, like Old Palo Alto, Crescent Park, because when you go closer to the bay, it's a flood zone, so you're not allowed to build basements there. If you go in the other direction, there's no groundwater, so it's kind of, the impacts really become localized for the people who live there.
I thought the city did a study on this maybe 5 years ago and looked at the issue of subsidence. Is this harming the aquifer? And I thought that their conclusion was no long-term impact, possibly no short-term impact either.
Good use of the word possibly, which is why they're about to spend a lot of money on studies. Yeah, they have done several studies already. This group Corolla did one like maybe a decade or so ago. The conclusion was it's a tentative conclusion that now the city's kind of distancing itself away from. But basically, 500 acre-feet of water is kind of like the number they gave for how much water could be pumped out every year. Or 1,500 in 1 year if you don't pump as much in other years. But the funny thing, this week, there were public works people were basically saying, we don't have that much confidence in these numbers, and the engineers don't even have that much confidence in these numbers. The water district, which oversees like many of the watershed issues, they're kind of pretty much admitting that we don't know that much about what's happening as far as the hydrogeology under Palo Alto in the north part of the county. So there's a lot of questions about the kind of long-term, big-picture hydrogeology issues that nobody really knows the answers to.
Is this an issue that is currently mostly limited to Palo Alto because of the cost of real estate, but is inevitably going to become an issue everywhere as more and more people want to put in basements? Is that part of, I mean, is there a bigger issue here than just the 14 homes and so forth that we might face?
Oh yeah, most certainly. I mean, I think a few people at the hearing, and it was actually an extremely well-attended meeting, considering it's on a Tuesday night, and you have like these geological, really wonky discussions about containment zones and cones of depression, my favorite term. Next punk band name. Anyway, so you have this really technical discussion, and you have like 50 people showing up to hear this, and many speakers being very adamant. And a few of them mentioned that similar issues have popped up in like Menlo Park, Atherton, other areas where the real estate values are high and where basement projects might be happening.
How have those cities addressed it?
I haven't really looked in that too much. This is mostly just kind of anecdotal from their concerns, but Yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that. And of course, it's a bigger issue kind of in other parts of the state where the groundwater levels are low, where people depend more on wells to get their water. So
if the people that are concerned about this issue, if we could recapture that water and put it to constructive use, does the issue go away for them, do you think? Or is there an issue about basements?
I don't think
Is this an anti-basement movement?
Yes and yes. Well, one issue will go away. There are several concerns that the residents have expressed. One of them would go away if this water was more used, which is about they see it as a waste of water.
Right.
So that issue would be taken care of. But there's other issues that it would not, like for example, the doors not opening.
The subsidence and shifting of the...
Yeah, impact on trees, like all that sort of thing. And there is a bit of an element of why do you need this giant basement? It doesn't help that 13 out of the 14 projects, in addition to building a giant basement, are also building a second story. So it does kind of create this kind of vibe of how much space do they need?
Right.
And it's like here's thousands of gallons of water. So
Yeah, the city, I forgot which, Mike Knopfsiger, I think it was, Public Works Department, came up with a way to capture or at least channel some of the water that's coming out of the basements by creating a filling station and also having trucks running around collecting the water. That was addressing only a small percentage of everything that was coming out of the ground.
yeah, that was a big feather in the cap of Public Works. It was like their Leonardo da Vinci moment. They invented this kind of system of trucking stations over at these dewatering sites. And one of the reforms that the committee was talking about is, well, they were talking about how to make better use of this water. So they might actually start requiring people who pump the groundwater to provide trucking services once a week to like local parks or neighboring properties, anybody who could use this water, which is not potable but can still be used for irrigation and construction purposes, things like
There's
that.
a
Maybe
little,
we could have water towers like at Petticoat Junction around the city that we could all just drive to and fill up when we needed water.
You know we're a built-out city. Come on.
50-foot height limit, come on.
Except for the 75% of open space. But anyway.
Well, I think one of the issues that came up actually with irrigation that was raised by Catherine Martineau of Canopy, the nonprofit tree organization, was just that there's a difference in salinity of the water that's coming out. I'm not sure exactly what the issue is, but I think a long-term use of that water for irrigation was, in her mind, posing a problem.
Yeah, and one person from Canopy, Marilyn Keller, former UAC commissioner, spoke on behalf of Canopy. She volunteers with them. And she also kind of raised that concern, just kind of asking the council to make sure that they analyze if they are going to use this water more. But this is an issue we see pop up anytime we're talking about recycled water. I mean, they were talking about a while ago about extending recycled water to Stanford Research Park. And it was, in that context, Canopy was pretty alarmed about the fact that the recycled water is more salty and would hurt the redwoods and things like that.
Yeah.
Gennady, the last time we reported on this, as I recall, the city staff was stating that the water that is being excavated for these basements was moving anyway into the streams and eventually to the bay. That there's this underground movement of water that same water that's getting pumped out to create a basement is moving to the bay anyway. I got the sense from reading your story this week that maybe they're backing off on the confidence in that kind of conclusion. Is that right? Or does anybody really know about this water?
I mean, in the broadest picture possible, they're sticking with the story. There was like a pretty good technical presentation about kind of the broader issues of what happens with groundwater. You have like the kind of porous layer, which is kind of sandy. You have like the shallow aquifer. You have this containment layer, which is clay or something less permeable, and you have the deep one. And basically, there is one of those symbols, kind of like you see in a recycling bin, with like the arrow, circle of arrows, because it flows into the bay and then it gets recharged. There's like a movement, and I wish I had that picture with me, but basically, there's rainwater that goes in, and from that perspective, that's still the picture, but they are acknowledging that they're not sure kind of about the quantity of water in each layer, about the relationship between the deep aquifer and the shallow. Is the containment layer really impermeable? It's pretty
There's a
technical
lot
discussion.
that's not known.
Yeah, they're just not exactly sure kind of what the groundwater situation is. I don't think they're really panicking about the fact that the groundwater, the shallow aquifer is going to be depleted or anything like that. But they are looking to make kind of beef up the regulations just to make sure that at least the very localized impacts are studied for the area just right next to the construction. So there is a little bit more of a sense of uncertainty and the kind of desire to kind of partner with the USGS or the water district to kind of study these issues more, get a better understanding. But I don't think they've kind of started panicking about, supply getting depleted or anything like that.
Will this issue go away if we just have a few years of really good stormy winters, do you think?
I don't know. I think people will still be angry about gigantic basements next door.
Well, there you go.
Construction sites. If there's something to the localized impacts, and again, it's hard for me to kind of make it's a correlation causation issue for me. It's like I feel their pain if they have cracks and the doors don't open, but I'm not sure what impact these particular dewatering projects. And there was one public speaker, Dan Garber, architect, who kind of made a point that the amount of groundwater that gets pumped for something like Homer Tunnel or Oregon Expressway just completely dwarfs all of these together. So I don't know if this is what caused these kind of home issues or not. So, I feel like as long as people's houses are cracking and there's construction next door, they're probably going to be raising questions about it. But
And the idea of a basement construction moratorium, which is what the group Save Our Groundwater is advocating for, how did that play out with the committee this week?
Well, there was no firm commitment to a moratorium, but there was a commitment to kind of revisiting the issue in a couple of weeks, actually. There's like basically a bunch of buckets, sorry, there's too many metaphors having to do with water, of activities, kind of like the short term, the medium term, and long term. I mean, in the long term, they're going to pursue this giant kind of groundwater management study, hopefully in partnership with other agencies. We're not going to see any progress on that for a long time. But some of the short-term things, they're going to come back like in January, and they might consider a moratorium. They might consider they're probably going to just consider changing the rules to kind of require people who do these projects to hire like an expert engineer to study the impacts of surrounding trees and houses. They talked a lot about that, and in January they're probably going to come back with a refined proposal to do that. Right now, moratorium isn't that big a deal because you're not allowed to do dewatering between October 31st and the beginning of April. So we're not going to see, that happening right now anyway. But they're going to try to get some new rules in place before the spring.
Are there extra fees that are charged, do you know, to a homeowner that wants to put in a basement other than whatever the square footage or?
There's a dewatering permit, which is a flat fee. And one of the things that some of the critics have maintained is that this is a very valuable resource and we should consider charging actually per gallon of water discharged, which is another thing that they're going to take a look at.
Do you know what the fee is for the dewatering permit?
I'm not exactly sure. I have a number, but I'm not certain about it.
Okay.
I have to verify it. And there's also been talk about longer-term solution, like looking at the zoning code, like where should basement construction be allowed. I don't think we're going to see any progress on that for a long time, but it should be interesting to see in January what they do about the localized impacts issue.
I guess we'll say that the residents until then will be pumped up on their issue. That's
Moratorium on puns. Okay.
That's it for this week. Behind the Headlines. Check us out online at paloaltoonline.com.